Spin attacks. So, to start, I've rewritten this script like 3 times, give or take. And that's partly because in the course of writing this and training alongside this, not only have my own views kind of changed, but the discussion around the topic has changed a little. So whether or not this is going to be completely relevant, I'm just going to get into it. This video is not really meant for your typical layman. This is kind of something I think only people within the sword fighting, the HEMA, maybe the LARP community would really care about. But let's just get into it. So spin attacks are, it's kind of a trope that it's so common in media that we don't even really think about it when we see it. But within the martial arts community, specifically HEMA and any like armed martial arts, it's a bit of a hot button issue. But in this video, I'm going to be discussing the critiques against spin attacks, where those critiques are valid, and where I think that they fall short. And going forward, I just want to keep in mind that, I'm not an expert, and when it comes to any art, it's a martial art, but it is an art. There's no authorities, so I just want to be open-minded and let the arguments stand on their own terms, on their own merits. First off, the proper thing to do is to define what a spin attack is. And for the sake of my video, the way that I want to define what a spin attack actually is any attack that once you start it, your torso is going to rotate at least 180 degrees, and in the course of that attack, you're going to be showing your back, or at least the back of your head, to the target. And if you're wondering why I'm coming up with my own definition, it's honestly because in all the media I've seen, nobody's really made a exact definition of what a spin attack is, or they'll have an extremely narrow definition, which to me borders on like straw manning. Not to point fingers at anyone in particular, because there's a lot of videos, and I haven't seen all the videos either, so keep that in mind. But anyhow, so based on my personal definition of what a spin attack is, here's a few examples of what spin attacks are. And this is kind of this is not a spin attack. These are not spin attacks, even though they kind of do a circular motion or flourish the blade. That doesn't make it necessarily a spin attack. With all that being said, I'm not implying that my proposed definition is perfect nor all-encompassing, so if anyone wants to talk about it in the comments, as if anyone's going to watch this video. But yeah, let's actually dig into some of the critiques against spin attacks and why they're valid. So, in all of the content I've seen, it boils down to spin attacks are slower because you have an extra step and a wind up into it, and they require you to look away for at least a moment, and in doing so, in doing the spin, you're exposing your back to your opponent. That's stuff we've already kind of gone over. And a lot of times, even if you do hit, it doesn't really make it more powerful. At least in stuff I've seen. Now, with my own techniques, on that last point, we might be able to have a little wiggle room there, because it's kind of like if you're gonna hit something with a baseball. Like, if you're gonna hit a baseball with a baseball bat, you're gonna wind up all the way, you know? So if you have more wind up, then you can hit more. You can put more power into it. So it is slower, but if done correctly, it has the potential. You have a longer kinetic chain, there's more wind up. If you bring it in, you can get more spin on it too. But again, it's slower, you're exposed, and it's ultimately more risky. Let me reiterate that the argument ultimately boils down to spin attacks being too high risk to be viable. You know, most people admit that it's possible to land a spin attack and get away without a scratch. So the real question to ask is it possible to make spin attacks more viable if you mitigate the risk factors? Oh, thank you. And I think it is. In what I've studied and what I've practiced, I think it is. Because I ultimately think that most of the critiques against spin attacks are missing a bit of a fundamental aspect about what spin attacks are and how they should be used. To illustrate this, I'm going to start to pull from a few different sources. So we're going to look at how spin attacks are presented in the critiques versus in actual fights with actual fighters utilizing them in actual combats. Excuse me, cat. Alright. So, for this part of the video, I'm going to be comparing a bit of sellsword arts, because they like to meme on the don't do spin attacks thing. And I'm going to compare that to an MMA fight. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, you can't... Cat... Well, people will say you can't really compare them because you can technically take more hits in unarmed combat, which is kind of true. It's not completely true, because you could get hit once and be out of the fight without a weapon. It all depends on the fight, really. So, and plus, in either case, whenever you're going to throw out a risky attack, you do have to account for the same things. So whether or not they're completely analogous, I think we can at least look to how the techniques are performed and see if there's something we can pull from there. You know, maybe there's some information we can glean. To me, that's how mixed martial arts works. You know, you take the good stuff, you leave out the bad stuff. So the video I'm going to be looking at is, it's here in my notes. Let's look at how to wheel kick or spinning back kick, heel kick, by Fight Tips. Here, he tells us how to pull off a spin kick. Pretty simple, it's in the title. First, one of the first things he actually points out is to not just throw it out, because it is risky. Even people who do this pretty regularly will know you don't want to just throw your back out to your opponent like a target. You know, it's pretty obvious. And that he says you should set it up with jabs, with feints, things like that. Very good advice. And when it comes to actually pulling off the technique, first thing you do, you set up your pivot leg. Then you turn to face your opponent, and that's when you release the kick. So it's kind of, you set it up to build up the tension and then release it in a snap. Whereas if you look at a lot of the sellsword art videos, the kind of memey ones, they just kind of do the spin. They'll throw a spin out there. Even in the ones where they're trying to figure out, like, can you do a spin, and they'll spar around a bit, they just sort of throw it out there. There's not really, at least in my opinion, a lot of thought behind the footwork or setting it up or things like that. Because to me, it's not so much a spin attack. Like, to me, it's less about the attack, more about the movement. But that's something we'll get into a little bit later. So, looking at actual fights, I'm going to be using wildest spinning finishes in UFC history by UFC. I'm going to use that as reference. When looking at the footage, I found that there's, on average, 2 ways that spin attacks are utilized. And the first one's purely offensively, and that's the way that I see a lot of people in LARPing. When it comes to sellsword arts critiquing spin attacks, it's usually directed towards the inexperienced person in like some sort of LARP group just throwing it out there. And that's how we see it with these spin kicks in UFC. They'll throw their back up like a shield and throw the kick out, which it's effective there, but of course you wouldn't try to do something like that necessarily in a sword fight. That's extremely risky. Which we do see in actual European sword fighting with like rapier fighting. If you look at one of Blood and Iron's videos, they do have one where you throw your back out and have your sword thrusting behind you as a means of both dodging and attacking, which to me, I mean, that checks all the boxes. That's a spin attack. But that's besides the point. Getting back to this footage, there is another way that I've noticed spin attacks are used, and that is in the strategic kind of way, where maybe the opponent moves behind them suddenly, so they offset their footwork and do a spin to attack behind them, or they'll use the feints, they'll use the jabs, they'll set up the situation to jump in and do a spin attack. And that's how I think, that's kind of the key to this whole thing. When I first started doing spin attack research and stuff, this whole rabbit hole, is that it's less about just throwing it out, and it is more about using it strategically, particularly with the footwork and the movement in mind. So let's start to see, can any of this actually be applied to sword combat, or is it forever destined to the realms of fisticuffs? But for the most part, this is where the part of the video critiquing the critiques of spin attacks is going to end, and this is where we're going to start to get into how to do a spin attack, when to do a spin attack, like where it's applicable, where it's not, how to make it safer and more effective, things like that. So, a lot of critics of spin attacks, people who like to meme on it, say it's just anime stuff, they'll actually, a lot of the techniques and uses of spin attacks I'm going to go over. I've actually heard it mentioned a few times, but then dismissed as like, it doesn't count as a technique, or there are exceptions to the rule, which I don't even know what that means. So they'll just sort of shrug them off, like these don't count as spin attacks because this or that. And I think that's part of the issue of it not being so well defined, which it's an art. It's hard to put things into boxes. There's no perfect maps, but still. Getting back to the point, if spin attacks are not really a head-on attack, then what are they good for? Well, first, it's important to remember that pretty much every technique that exists in any discipline is, it's not just a thing that you throw out. Every single one that's taught is a solution to a particular problem. So any technique, when you use it at the wrong time, in the wrong way, anything like that, you're gonna get messed up. It's just like a game of chess. A lot of times people compare a sword fight to a fast-paced game of chess, and one wrong move, it'll lead to your defeat in the end. So you gotta choose your techniques carefully. So, what are the benefits of a spin attack? What are some things we can leverage using these techniques? And as I've kind of already hinted at, it's the footwork here. So, in order to start to answer that question, we're going to actually have to get into how to perform these techniques. So, we've gone over how to do a spin kick. If you wanted to check out that guy's video, you should do that. But if you're only familiar with HEMA and Western techniques, you're probably not going to be able to get the whole spin thing down. You got to look elsewhere. You got to broaden those horizons. So some of the things I'm going to be pulling from are Eastern techniques, but I'm going to cite my sources if people want to look into them. So first, we're going to start with the footwork. It's the most basic, where we all start. Here, I rely on the twistiest, most circle-based martial art I know, Bagua Zhang. For a detailed breakdown of the footwork, I would recommend Learn Bagua Zhang with Brandon Sugiyami, Part 1, by Jiao Wushu News and Media. And here, Brandon explains how to do the quick turnaround, as well as one of the most important aspects, that is isolating your torso from your lower half. That's arguably kind of one of the linchpins to the whole technique. For an explanation on how to actually walk a circle around your opponent, I would recommend Bagua for beginners, The Footwork by Kung Fu and Tai Chi Center with Jake Mace. And there's the last one that I'm mostly going to be pulling from here is Why Cutting Mats Makes You Worse at Kenjutsu by Ask Seki Sensei. So these three, especially when it comes to the actual sword techniques, can be drawing a lot from Ask Seki Sensei's stuff. But for the sake of this video, those are the three ones that I would hope you at least just skim through them just to kind of get an idea of what we're going to be like, get an idea of like what you're looking at here. But I'm gonna do my best to kind of explain, and I got plenty of footage myself messing around with these techniques. So here, let's go ahead and get into it. In order to start tying the concepts together, I think it's best to start with the body mechanics. When you're swinging a sword, your effective cutting range is typically about 180 degrees of the direction that your torso is facing. And I'm not saying like that's how you should be swinging your sword. I'm saying the range of like where you can cut effectively is typically within that range. You know, it's hard to swing at something that's behind you. You can threaten something that's behind you, but it's hard to swing at something that's behind you and actually cut it. So whenever we look at Ask Seki Sensei's video, we see when you're swinging the sword, you're not just swinging it, you're doing this step in, and that step, just like doing the spin kick, it's acting as a pivot. So the pivot of a circle. So as you're turning with these sword strikes, you know, you're sort of doing a half turn of a circle here, and it actually brings your cutting range from about 180 degrees up to, what is that, almost 360, and you haven't even looked away from your opponent. That's, you can now swing in a whole circle around you nearly, and you haven't even looked away from your opponent just by taking one step. Again, that's not how you shouldn't make a giant circle swing, and it's super telegraphed. I'm just saying the range of areas you can throw your cuts, it greatly increases just from one half turn. So if we start to combine that with the Bagua footwork, where you do you bring your foot inwards, you can add another rotation into that. That brings your effective cutting range up to 540 degrees, so you can get more cuts all around you. And your torso ultimately completes 360 degrees. So there's your spin. And in doing so, depending on where your target is, you probably turned back to them if you've gone in a full circle. But this is the most fundamental spin attack. These are the core concepts that we're working with here. But again, you know, as we went before, it's not really something you just throw out. It's not a head-on attack. So what do we do with it? So a good place to start in terms of what spin attacks are good for is distance. So as we've seen in Ask Seki Sensei's videos, in order to spin, you need to do a step. You don't just stand in place as you spin, you know. You have to take steps forwards, or you could do backwards, or in order to step off of the line, you might step off to the side and then pivot. Not kind of like in one-ish motion. You know, it's as a means to dodge. You know, that stepping off the line is something that is fundamental to pretty much any swordplay, east or west. But spinning is a means of doing that. You know, you're pivoting off of one leg or the other leg. So if you pivot off of your outside leg, you'll, by nature of how circle works, move away off the line. So it's possible to use that to your advantage if you use it in a smart way. And in this part, I was just wanting to demonstrate a way of measuring distance. So the triangle is meant to be from your eye level to the tip of your sword to the opponent's feet, and that forms a right triangle. And the distance is going to be just under 2 steps. So you can see when I take a single step, it makes the distance enough to hit. And I'm just showing that it's always the same whether it's your sword is drawn or you're doing a quick draw or not. So then you see here I took another 2 steps back, and that is to show that even with a step in at this distance, it's not enough. So if we combine our bagua footwork and all that stuff, we'll see that with a spin in, it gains enough distance to make that strike. But what I'm mostly getting into is using it as a means of counter. A lot of times when you look at critiques or like people who they're like looking at LARP videos or something, you'll just sort of throw this spin attack out, and that is definitely a good way to get killed, unless you have a shield on your back. But if your opponent is throwing an attack out, or if you've clashed swords, or maybe you're in a bind where you have control or information on where your opponent's weapon is, then you can spin. So long as you're outside of their reach or their weapon's not an issue at the moment, then you can spin if you need to. And sometimes that spin is a good way to, if you look into Baguazhang, where you're sort of walking the circle path, that you also tend to spiral in on your opponent, because the issue with a lot of swordplay, especially when it comes to Western combat, is it's very linear, which in Western combat has it makes sense, but like I said, techniques are solutions to certain problems, and it's not super often you're going to end up in this one-on-one sword fight like you would nowadays. Usually you would have some sort of battlefield weapon or something like that. But anyhow, another means of countering, like specifically whenever it gets into the bind, where you actually have some feedback, like anyone who's done a bit of sword combat, where you get into the bind, you feel that push and pull, and we see in some of Yasuke Sensei's videos where even without spinning, there's plenty of techniques for dealing with the bind. But in my experience, I think it's a little tricky with the bind because you're so close, but I think that helps, because where you can kind of, your back is to your opponent, but you're so close to your opponent that they won't be able to hit your back even if they wanted to. So it's a good way of kind of sliding past your opponent, hitting them on the way out, or if they've got you in a particular sticky situation, you can use it to retreat and still kind of threaten them. Even if you're not slicing, you can threaten the areas you can't fully see. And in pretty much anyone's experience, if you've had any kind of sword fighting experience, you'll know, even if your opponent doesn't know a lot about sword fighting, you have to, deal with the threat of them just swinging it haphazardly. You can't just dance around it because it's not a perfect cut that they threw. That's why in a lot of times when people actually try to do these spin attacks, you'll find that when they do the spin, it's hard to actually stab them, because if you have your sword up, you can threaten behind you, and we're gonna actually get into that a little more in terms of the techniques I'm starting to put together with all of these these concepts I'm thinking about. So now we have a general picture of kind of the footwork and what we're trying to do with the spin attacks. So let me start to get into the actual sword part of it and the concepts that I came up with. And I promise the way the naming came out was an accident. But there's locking and loading the blade. That's what I'm calling it. And for the most part, I think it's stuff that most people already understand, but I don't know if it's ever been framed in the way I'm about to describe it. So I'm not inventing this, but I'm just sort of highlighting these aspects of sword fighting because they're important to pulling off these kind of techniques. Okay. So when it comes to locking the blade, it's a pretty simple concept of just freezing your sword in 3D space. And you can do that in like one of its rotational axes, or maybe a single point, or along a certain edge, so something like that. Whether or not you're trying to do spin attacks, I think it's a pretty good just sword drill, just for not just for practicing for like binds and such, but just it's good to help your aim because it's really focusing on like the anatomy of your sword. Loading the blade is a easy concept, hard to describe. But I think once you understand it, you'll be like, oh, this is already a pretty familiar concept. Especially if you learn guards, like maybe you study Hema and you learn to swing your sword, and you kind of land in one guard, and then you swing and you land into another guard. You know, it's a really good defensive strategy. But take that concept, now take away the guards. And the idea is that you swing your sword wherever it lands, freeze it there, you lock it, and then you position yourself to swing it again. So rather than bring your sword back and swing it, you move to swing your sword. It's I know it sounds really weird. The best way to visualize it that I can come up with is like put your sword out in front of you, or you know, if you don't have a sword, just hold a stick out. And the goal here is to swing it like a baseball bat, but also you can't move the sword. So you freeze the sword in 3D space, and without moving it, or moving it as little as possible, you position yourself like you're gonna hit it, like swinging a baseball. And that's the idea. So just doing that during combat. So you swing, and then, you know, freeze it, reposition, swing. In order to make the spin attack work, you have to swing and position at the same time. Because otherwise you start to get into that situation where it is too slow. So it especially drills home the fact you can't just throw out a spin attack willy-nilly. If you have to position your footwork in tandem with it, you have to have an idea of where you're going and how you're getting there, which means you have to have an idea of where your opponent's weapon is, which means if they're guarded up, you don't want to do that because then they can just poke you. But if you've clashed, or maybe you've parried and slapped their sword to the side, then you can go in, like maybe they're trying to retreat, so you use your footwork to spin in and go for a very quick cut. It could work. It is risky, but also you're in a sword fight. Name one situation where it's not risky. That's kind of my, I'm not going to say argument, but yeah. So, but maybe you're thinking like all these little tricks and kind of counter cuts. Maybe you're in the camp of like, well, they don't count as techniques, or these are exceptions to the rule, or whatever. Maybe like, oh, you don't spin enough or something. So I did come up with, at first I was just like, oh, these are really only good for counters. But in the course of coming up with these, I started to think, well, maybe there is a way you can set these up offensively. And I thought of two. One is way more extreme, so I'll save that. I'll put that one last. The first one's pretty simple. If you're familiar with especially like Hema and like Western combat using those types of swords, I'm sure you've seen the type of grip where you put your thumb on the on the flat of the blade, and that gives you significant rotational power, especially if you're two-handing it. Kind of yes, if you have a one-handed sword, but it's more for two-handed, I believe. And that actually pairs really, really well with all of this footwork kind of counter cut stuff that we've been talking about. So, say you start here, you're gonna throw your first cut, your first two cuts. This is gonna be like a three-piece combo. The situation is you parry their sword, and as you parry, you see that they're going to retreat. So your first two cuts are going to smack down their sword, and preferably you want it to smack away, off to the side if you can, or because down, it's a little bit easier for them to just point their sword up to try to threaten you, but to the side, especially if you hit it really nice, it's hard to recover from that. So in that moment where you see them go to retreat, you do the step, you gain that distance, you do a downward cut, and you're going to let go with your second hand in order to gain a little extra distance, because again, distance is sort of the thing we're going with when it comes to spin attacks. So again, this would probably work better against opponents with longer weapons, where you do need to make a risky move, because if your opponent has a longer weapon, you're already at a disadvantage. Maybe you might as well try something a little risky, because if you just stay defensive for too long, they're going to find a hole in your defense somewhere. So it's a quick way to close the gap. If your footwork is snappy, not just spinning, you have to load it up, snap. It's a load and a snap, and it can be hard to get used to that. But yeah, the second technique that I have thought up, it can be set up to just sort of keep going indefinitely. I would not recommend trying to do that in a real fight, because you don't want to do that ever. You don't want to just keep spamming the same thing over and over in a fight, because eventually they'll find a way around it. It's a little, you can see it here because I'm going to show it, but it's again with the flat of the blade, and this can be done with something like a katana a little differently. First I'm going to describe it with the standard sort of long sword setup. So with the thumb on the flat of the blade, you're going to do a small cut, sort of like a sweeping cut at sort of belly height, and as you're doing that, you're setting up your spin. As you do the spin, you're bringing that up. They'll talk about like kind of crossing and uncrossing your arms. So as you're bringing them up, you're uncrossing them, setting them up, and at the same time throwing another cut behind you. So preferably with something with a long sword. If you're at a pretty close distance, that is a significant head swipe. Would not recommend throwing this out if you have a very short weapon. You would have to get in very close if that's the case. But anywho, you throw that, and then as you are finishing that spin, you come in with a third cut. And if you get the footwork right, with that third cut, you can keep going and set up the whole thing to keep going again. And the two issues with doing this too much is, one, you can get dizzy, and two, the opponent would eventually kind of, because those cuts are coming, you can angle them differently, but for the most part they're coming in predictably in a pattern. So, but when it comes to Baguazhang, which is all about walking that circle, these twisty movements, in order to offset the dizziness, you just start spinning in the other direction. So normally you can start to feel that vertigo come on, like at least 1 or 2 spins before it actually hits you. So once you start to feel it, you basically hold off that spin for like a half a pace, and then you can start it up in the other direction. And even if you only do like 1 or 2, it's a good way to level it out. In my experience, it works very well. It will not work if you are already very dizzy. It doesn't. It's not a cure for dizziness. But if you start to get dizzy, it'll sort of stop it. So ultimately, I'm not going to get too much more into it. I think for the most part, this makes the case that I was wanting to make, and that is, it's not that spin attacks are superior, or that they're some secret killer move that's going to win you every fight. I think I've made that pretty clear. It's just that they're viable, and the way I see it, if you can do it and get away with it, then it's valid. And if you can do it and get away with it consistently enough, then it's a viable technique. I'm thinking I might make videos going into more detail on how these techniques work and how they combine the different aspects of Bagua with the techniques that I learned from Yasuke Sensei's videos, kind of coupled with some of my own. I obviously sprinkle in a lot of fundamentals from Western techniques in with it too, because I don't think I'm trying to make my own martial art per se, but everybody has their own style. You take the best from what you see. I think I'm making something that can work. Anyone who sword fights these days, I think you can attest that it's hard to find people to spar with. So pretty much all of this is an experimental technique kind of deal. If you all want to play around with this stuff, if you want to look at the source material, I'll link them down below, and maybe you'll find more inspiration elsewhere. I'm still learning a whole bunch. Even as I was writing this, I'm still learning stuff that I haven't even been able to include in this whole thing, as long as it's gotten so far. If anyone's interested, I can go into more detail about my sword stuff, but I mostly just wanted to make the case that if you're gonna say spin attacks are bad, it's usually because you don't know how to do it. And it's fair to dunk on whatever LARPers are just trying to have fun and just say, "Ooh, these people don't know how to use swords." Like, they're not there to do that, so it's whatever. Or in theatrics, it's there to look cool, so it's not there to be realistic, even if you want to kind of tear that apart. I do get the video games thing, because you do want it to be kind of realistic. That's part of the fantasy, I think. So you want it to at least make sense. But one thing I think I've been wanting to get into, this whole video has been meant as a bit of a primer to a Demon Slayer discussion, because I want to get into the validity and the historical inspiration that you see in Demon Slayer, because a lot of the stuff you learn, especially in Yasuke Sensei's videos, I can't shout him out enough. You should really check him out. He's pretty cool. But you can see the parallels, and I want to make a video kind of pointing out more of those, and how they could, maybe some of the breathing styles can be interpreted into actual combat. And a lot of them, I mean, you watch the show, I'm sure, you can see that they spin a lot, so that's part of what led down this rabbit hole as well, is like, can these work in real life? Because Demon Slayer, what I love about it is it kind of bridges that gap. And I think that some of the techniques, you can at least get some inspiration out of it, but that's obviously a whole video in and of itself. This is going on way too long. But yeah, hopefully this video is something you liked. If you got to this point, I'm sure it wasn't that helpful. So thank you for watching.